The story of Friedrich Nietzsche begins not in the whirlwind of his later philosophical provocations, but in the quiet, somber life of a pastor's family in Rücken. Born into a lineage of clergy, young Nietzsche's early years were shadowed by profound loss. At just 5 years old, he endured the insanity and death of his father, followed shortly by the death of his younger brother. By 1850, his mother relocated the grieving family to Naumburg, taking with her a boy shaped by tragedy and discipline, destined, at least in his family's eyes, to follow his father's path into the clergy. Even in these formative years, Nietzsche's character was set apart. Mourning did not weaken him, it forged in him seriousness and an extraordinary willpower. His classmates nicknamed him the Little Shepherd, not out of mockery, but out of respect for the quiet authority he exuded. Nietzsche commanded distance, never resorting to cries for help, even when grappling with his inner struggles. His moral compass was unyielding. He abhorred lying, seeing it as an unforgivable evil, and subjected himself to rigorous self-examinations. These moments of intense introspection left him trained but resolute, emerging each time with an unbroken integrity. This iron will occasionally manifested in dramatic displays of resolve. One story tells of a classmate doubting the tale of Mucius Scaevola, a Roman hero who thrust his hand into fire to prove his courage. Nietzsche, when just a boy, seized the glowing coal, held it tightly in his fist, his body trembling but unwavering. For minutes he stood rigid, his teeth clenched in defiance of the pain. Even after the burn left it lasting scar, he bore it as a badge of self-discipline. A child's stubbornness transformed into the early foundation of a powerful will. Yet he was not merely a figure of cold resolve. His fiery strength found its release at the piano. Music became his sanctuary, a channel for his stormy inner world. 10 years old, a Handel choir had revealed to him the transcendent power of music, a revelation that opened an entirely new realm of experience. The world of opera, with its interplay of light and shadow, gods and men, illusion and reality, became for Nietzsche a metaphor for existence itself. At the piano, he unleashed furious improvisations, as though pouring his soul into the keys, only to retreat afterward into profound silence. This boy, who would one day challenge the foundations of Western thought, was already wrestling with the eternal themes that would define his work: discipline, pain, beauty, and the relentless pursuit of truth, no matter how devastating. The next chapter in Nietzsche's journey began in 1858, when he entered Fortes College, an elite institution where his intellectual and existential awakening truly took root. Here, Nietzsche encountered two towering forces of thought that would shape his inner world: Greek culture and Romantic Christianity. Those were not merely subjects of study, they were the catalysts of a profound moral and spiritual crisis. The clash between the ancient ideals of beauty and virtue and the moral strictures of his inherited faith tore at him, ultimately leading to the collapse of his religious convictions. Yet Nietzsche was not one to wallow in despair. Where others might have succumbed to bitterness or disillusionment, his pride and resolve propelled him upward. He saw his loss of faith not as a defeat but as an opportunity, a necessary step in the ascent to higher understanding. And this marked the beginning of Nietzsche's lifelong commitment to self-overcoming. By the time he entered the University of Bonn, Nietzsche had decisively abandoned the idea of becoming a pastor. To prove to himself that he had severed ties with his old path, he dove headfirst into the raucous traditions of German student life. The beer halls, tobacco, drinking songs, and even duels. But these indulgences left him disillusioned. Nietzsche craved something deeper, something more profound. His brief stint in Berlin only deepened this dissatisfaction. The rigid, dull atmosphere of Prussian culture repelled him. And finally, he arrived in Leipzig, where his true intellectual transformation began. It was in Leipzig in 1865 that Nietzsche stumbled upon a book that would change his life, The World as Well and Representation by Arthur Schopenhauer. A strange impulse drove him to buy it. "I don't know what demon whispered to me, 'Go home with this book,'" he later recalled. And once he opened it, there was no turning back. The encounter with Schopenhauer's energetic, dark genius consumed him entirely. For 2 weeks, Nietzsche barely slept or ate, rereading the text obsessively. He even interrupted his reading to translate Schopenhauer's philosophical ideas into music at the piano, captivated by the notion that music was the purest expression of the will, the primal force at the heart of existence. In Schopenhauer, Nietzsche found a mentor of sorts, one who freed him from the stale constraints of academic philosophy and invited him to confront the raw, unvarnished truths of life. Schopenhauer's philosophy, indifferent to moral ends and grounded in the acceptance of destiny, resonated deeply with Nietzsche's evolving worldview. This was the second great step in his intellectual journey, a liberation from the philosophy of the classroom and a plunge into the passionate embrace of fate. This journey did not stop there. Learning that the towering figure of German music, Richard Wagner, was himself a disciple of Schopenhauer, Nietzsche was drawn into the orbit of yet another transformative influence. Through Wagner, Nietzsche would come to explore the idea of recreating the universe on aesthetic terms, seeking in art an answer to the existential questions that pure reason could not resolve. Nietzsche arrived in Basel in 1869 to take up a chair in philology, a position granted to him with the support of his mentor, Friedrich Nietzsche, who recognized the young scholar's extraordinary promise. At just 25, Nietzsche found himself thrust into a position of prestige and intellectual freedom, and the first year in Basel would prove to be one of the happiest of his life. It was a time of discovery, connection, and artistic communion, a brief calm before the storms that would later define his existence. He quickly formed meaningful relationships with two towering figures of intellectual Basel, the historian Jacob Burckhardt and the theologian Franz Overbeck. Burckhardt, who revealed to Nietzsche the grand sweep of history, would later acknowledge his friend's genius with gracious humility. Overbeck, meanwhile, became a trusted confidant and one of the few friends who would stand unwaveringly by Nietzsche in the darkest hours of his life. But the centerpiece of Nietzsche's time in Basel was his relationship with Richard Wagner and his wife Cosima. The Wagners, then living in Tribschen on the idyllic shores of Lake Lucerne, welcomed Nietzsche into their world with warmth and generosity. Despite the significant age difference between the young philosopher and their legendary composer, their bond transcended the barriers of time and fame. It was an extraordinary intellectual communion, a rare and profound meeting of minds. Nietzsche was captivated by Wagner's ability to articulate and expand upon Schopenhauer's philosophy, especially the notion of music as the highest art, a royal path to the essence of existence. Wagner, for his part, found in Nietzsche a budding genius whose ideas on the tragic heroism of Aeschylus resonated deeply with his own creative vision. The relationship was a fiery dance of mutual inspiration, a sacred exchange where Nietzsche's philosophical ascent found its complement in Wagner's artistic genius. The dynamic between them was magnetic. Wagner, the master of storms, sensed in Nietzsche the youthful spark of originality, and Nietzsche, in turn, sought light from Wagner to illuminate his burgeoning ideas. Together, they created what can only be described as a convergence of creative forces, a central burning focus that eclipsed the mundane hum of life around them. During these moments, the world seemed to pause, leaving only the resonance of their shared visions. The most sublime expressions of their bond came through music. Nietzsche, seated at the piano, improvised some cantatas, pouring his passions into waves of harmony that seemed to echo Wagner's grand symphonic storms. In these moments, Nietzsche and Wagner found the full majesty of their connection. The young philosopher's thought seemed to anticipate themes of Wagner's Parsifal, blending the twilight of one era with the dawning of another. Yet, as with all such intense relationships, theirs was destined to wear thin over time, as the complexities of their individual paths led them in divergent directions. But in those first luminous years in Basel, Nietzsche and Wagner forged a connection that would forever shape their respective legacies, a meeting of minds as rare as it was profound.